Hi and welcome back to ScottiesTech.Info. I'm Scotty with my co-host Cletus. And a few weeks ago it was my birthday and I got a book. I've done it again. I read another book. And this is the book. It's called AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order. Kind of a dramatic title. It's a New York Times bestseller and it was written by Kai-Fu Lee. So, okay, who is Kai-Fu Lee? Well, Dr. Lee, he has a PhD in computer science, and he is the manager of a company called Sinovation Ventures. It's a venture capital company in China's version of Silicon Valley, and he invests primarily in like AI-type Chinese tech startup companies. So he's kind of an interesting character because he worked for like Microsoft and Apple and Google, and he was doing mostly AI stuff for them apparently. And he was part of the whole Google China thing when Google wanted to move into China and they ran into all kinds of problems. He was there for that, and eventually he decided to kind of ditch American companies and go, and he started this Sinovation Ventures. And so now he's helping to start Chinese tech companies specifically related to AI. So he wrote this book, AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order. And as you may have guessed, it's about AI. But kind of in a sort of roundabout way, because there's a lot of information in there about China itself and China's tech companies. And of course, nowadays we hear everything about like Huawei. Germany doesn't want to buy Huawei's 5G systems, or the US doesn't, or blah, 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 because they're spying on everybody, and, all this kind of stuff. There are a lot of Chinese companies where in the past China was basically the copycat. Apple would produce an iPhone, and in China they would make an iPhone ripoff. It would be smaller, way less powerful, it wouldn't exactly be an iPhone, and then of course they'd sell it very cheap, and, you know the story. And of course, we all know that everything is made in China, so they have this massive manufacturing capacity. But in terms of innovation, until very recently, they weren't really innovating that much. They were mostly just copying. We see also in kind of like the military sphere, suddenly China has like a 5th generation fighter jet. Like, where did that come from? How did all that, come about? So he talks about AI in the book, but it's not really general AI as people think about it in sci-fi movies. As I've talked about in previous videos, it's actually more like deep learning, which is essentially you have a black box, which is an algorithm, and the algorithm is set to optimize for something like, make a person click on an ad or not click on an ad. How do you do that? Well, you write this algorithm, and you have to. It has inputs and outputs, and the output feeds back to the input, and there's an algorithm inside, and what's really needed is mountains of data, because the algorithm, it can be super good, but it doesn't matter unless you have mountains of data so that it can actually like consider all the different possibilities and see like, well, what do people in the US do, and what do people in Australia do, and what do people in France do, and different geographic regions, different demographics, different, male versus female. Like, it has to sort of process all this data, and in doing so, it can do crazy things. Or, for example, if you used AI to look at the result of like a medical scan, like to see if you had cancer or not, a human doctor only knows so much. Whereas if we used AI to do that, you could literally have a computer, roomfuls of computers, and running this AI, this deep learning algorithm that would literally process all the scans that it could get its hands on. And over time, it would get better and better. And then you could feed the data of like the survival rate, all these people, here are their scans, did they survive, what happened with their cancer. You could feed all that information back into the system, and it would learn far better than any human would, to the point where you might not even need a radiologist anymore, because the AI could actually determine better than any single human doctor or even groups of doctors what kind of, do you have cancer? What kind is it? What is your survivability rate? And even which treatment will be optimal. It's just so much data to process. And of course, this kind of deep learning AI can process this data very quickly and efficiently. So that's the kind of AI that we're talking about now. Right. That's actually not the most interesting part about the book. The most interesting part about the book is what he says about China. So as I said, back in the day, not so long ago, China was kind of viewed as the copycat. And indeed, that's exactly what they did. Like I gave the example of the iPhone. They were iPhone knockoffs, blah, blah, blah. But what he says, and one of the things that I found very interesting was that China suddenly has become a powerhouse in AI. And the way that this happened is actually pretty interesting. For a very long time, China was a relatively poor country, and it's a country of 1.4 billion people. That's 4 times the size of the population of the United States, but they were relatively poor. So, back in the day, like say in 1998, when 30% of Americans were connected to the internet, in that same year, 1998, only 0.2% of the population of China were connected to the internet. And yet now here we are in 2019, and we have Huawei doing all this stuff, and they're building all kinds of crazy stuff, and it's like suddenly the Chinese are actually publishing about half of the new papers in AI research. I mean, just a few short years ago, it was hardly none, and now they've become like a powerhouse in this field. So how did they actually get there? And that's the part that's the more interesting story. So, as I said back in the day, China was a relatively poor country, so on and so forth. And so obviously when smartphones came out, they kind of started copying them and stuff. But at that time, we in the West, of course, had like laptops and desktops and all kinds of fancy toys. But China being a relatively poorer country, they didn't have all this stuff. But suddenly they were able to produce inexpensive smartphones, and suddenly more and more people had smartphones. So I'm kind of summarizing here, but more or less what they did is they started having all these people with inexpensive smartphones, and there were a bunch of startup companies. Now, he goes into more detail here about how these startup companies happened. For example, you had Facebook in the US, and then you had, I forget the name of it, but it was a Chinese company that was essentially a Facebook ripoff. And of course, some of these would be successful and others weren't, and some of them became very, very successful. And of course, they designed everything to work better on the Chinese infrastructure with slower Chinese smartphones. They even tweaked things, whereas Google would go in and try to use their Google Smart, all their Google services and offer them in China as is. The Chinese developers would actually say, hang on a minute. And they would do studies, and they would find out that, say, like when an American looks at Google search results, they did eye tracking, and they found that an American does a Google search result, and primarily they're looking in the upper left-hand corner at the first maybe 2 or 3 results. But the Chinese people, when they're searching, they wanted a page of search results, and they were actually scanning all over the entire page, mostly in the first, second, and third results. But they were kind of like absorbing more information. It was more like they were going shopping as opposed to just kind of consuming whatever the system was telling them. They would just kind of take it and consume it right away. The Chinese were kind of using these systems differently. So Chinese developers were actually able to come up with equivalent systems in China that the Chinese people actually liked better. And this eventually led to systems like WeChat, where all of a sudden you had a whole bunch of Chinese people. They didn't have laptops, they didn't have desktops, but suddenly they had this little smartphone in their hand. And so all the Chinese developers said, hey, we can make this whole system where, and they did, where you can use your smartphone, scan a QR code when you're at the local market buying vegetables, and it's paid through your phone. You can buy train tickets online. You can book flights online. You can pay your taxes online. You can do literally everything with your crappy little smartphone. That's very different from the West. I mean, here in the West, it's, Apple just announced Apple Pay with the magical card. Over there, they've been doing that for years already. The other interesting thing is that when they started having this success, the Chinese government stepped in and they said, well, there was an event with the formerly British company DeepMind, I think it was called, which was bought by Google. They created this AI system called AlphaGo. It played like the Chinese Go champion. Go is kind of like a little board game, and the AI won. And this was kind of like, this kind of lit a fire under everyone's bum in China. And suddenly, like the Chinese government decided, okay, we're going to take this neighborhood in Beijing. It basically is China's Silicon Valley, called Zhongguancun, I think. I probably mutilated that. So they created this neighborhood, and the Chinese government started saying, here, have 1 million, 2 million. And within a matter of like a few short years, you had like 6,000 new startup companies in China. And in fact, they were working so hard that he tells a story, Dr. Li tells a story where there was a guy who was working in Zhongguancun in China, the Chinese Silicon Valley, and he went to work in the real Silicon Valley in the US. And his coworkers in Silicon Valley basically told him point blank, dude, you're not in China anymore. You don't need to work so hard. And of course, we all know how, startup companies in Silicon Valley, they work like crazy. So in China, it's like 50 million times more intense. The competition is also extremely fierce. Obviously, if you have like 6,000 startups, it's like dog eat dog. To me, it was actually fascinating because what you have is this cutthroat competition, and it's like, we tend to look at China as this sort of like, more communist type place, and yet the cutthroat competition that's going on over there in the high-tech field, including in AI, is like, it's like so competitive, it's actually almost more capitalist than in the West. Like it actually surprised me to see how crazy it was. And of course, they're succeeding, and then one company gobbles up another, and they grow, and they have, companies worth $30 billion that, like I say, you can do everything with your smartphone, and, systems that are actually fancier than what we have, say, in the US or Western Europe or Australia or something. But anyway, so another thing the Chinese companies did differently is in the West, they would say, well, we're going to start a system where we'll put bikes all over a city, and you can use your smartphone, and you can, scan a code or use Bluetooth or something, and you can just grab a bike, you pay a small fee, you can ride the bike wherever, and then you leave it in another drop-off station anywhere else in the city, and we'll write the software that sort of manages all this, and okay, there you go. In the West, that kind of system would be done where it's sort of like, we're the information economy, so we don't do any of the actual hard work, we just do the programming and make the app and do the cool stuff, and we leave handling the bikes and maintenance and all that stuff to somebody else. In China, what they did in recent years is someone would decide to do the same thing, but they would actually buy the bikes themselves. They would get the bikes, they would install GPS trackers on them, they would figure out the QR codes or the Bluetooth, or they'd integrate the payment system, they would pick up the bikes and move them around, they would do maintenance on all the bikes, they literally did everything. So they would often do this at a loss and even give the service away for free. So they were losing money like crazy, but in doing so, they would find other little business opportunities, or they'd become so popular that then they could integrate some other little thing or have some advertisements or something. So in the short run, they were basically like burning through cash like crazy, but in the long run, it paid off. Whereas in the West, it's kind of like, oh no, you're not making a profit. I mean, not all companies, but the extent to which they were willing to sort of take these crazy, insane risks, I think a lot of which was because most of these people came from poorer backgrounds, and here they saw this opportunity, and so they jumped on it, and they blood, sweat, and tears poured into it, and they made the company successful. So I thought that was kind of interesting, because it's almost like the competition and the my company is better than yours and that sort of thing seems to be even more intense in China than it is even in Silicon Valley, which is like totally crazy. There's all this information in here about China and how it's developed in recent years and how all these high-tech powers came into being. And the story, that to me is the most fascinating story. There is actual stuff about AI, and his argument there is basically, you probably heard recently, like this guy Andrew Yang, he wants to run for president of the US in the next election, and he's saying we should have like the universal basic income because AI is going to destroy jobs and so on and so forth. Dr. Li basically says the same thing, except he says, well, it's actually going to be worse than that, because as I mentioned in an example previously, like a radiologist might not be necessary anymore. even in like engineering positions wouldn't be necessary anymore. There are a lot of occupations where, even in like the medical field, you don't need so many doctors and nurses, but what you might need is people who are more trained in like psychology, psychiatry, human care, so to speak. That would become more popular. But there would obviously be a large shift as AI takes over certain businesses, and it would take over a lot of them. There would obviously be this massive shift in employment, and it would kind of create a disaster. So he kind of, goes off and says like love is the answer and everything, and I tend to agree with that. I just don't see how it's actually going to happen in our world. It's not really enough to say love is the answer. You have to find a way to like when people are hungry and starving, and that's not really going to get you there. So I think he's right. I'm just not sure how we're going to get from point A to point B. And I think in the short term, should what all these people are predicting happen, it's going to be kind of a mess for a while. But in any case, about AI, he says China has an advantage. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned earlier, when you have your deep learning black box, what you need is lots of data. And because China has like the whole population of 1.4 billion almost with smartphones, and because they have all these systems even where you can buy your plane tickets and your train tickets and pay your taxes and order food online and do everything from one app on your smartphone, they have hoovered up massive quantities of data. So that's actually one of the reasons he says why in recent years the Chinese are suddenly kind of forging ahead, and they're publishing like about half the new AI papers and research and stuff, whereas a few short years ago they weren't even on the radar. So his argument is that, well, China will actually be the leader because in order to have better deep learning AI, you need more data, and China has like an overabundance of data. So I don't know, we'll have to see. I should probably also mention that Dr. Li apparently is someone who has spoken out against internet censorship in China. He was born in Taiwan. There were a couple incidences in recent years where he kind of came out and said, no, this isn't good for business. Don't do this. You're stifling creativity. You're stifling innovation. He also makes no mention in the book of the Chinese social credit system. That's the system that they're getting up and running now, and it's supposed to be done by like 2020, where they're basically taking all this data, and it's like if you play too many online games, your social credit score goes down. If your social credit score goes down too far, then you can't book train tickets or plane tickets. So it's like suddenly they're using this system, and it almost sounds like a good idea if it was applied kind of loosely or to like criminals or something. But like one of the things I read, and I'm not sure if this is true, but one of the things I read was that if you get into too much debt, your social credit score goes down. But then if your social credit score is down, you can't actually get a job. Well, how are you supposed to pay off your debt if you can't get a job? So there are certain things about it that seem like a little bit kind of kooky, and he makes no mention of that in the book, at least as far as I can remember. So I thought that kind of stood out. But he is actually a little bit outspoken against any kind of censorship. Obviously, he's for innovation, and you can't have real innovation if you have censorship. Which is another interesting thing, because here you have all this crazy innovation and the government is actually funding it, but then at the same time they have the social credit thing, which is a little bit odd. So we'll have to see where it all goes, but if nothing else, I mean, the AI part, we're going to have to wait and see for that. Maybe Andrew Yang is right, maybe this guy is right. We just have to wait and see. But the book is actually an excellent read if you just want to see like what's been going on inside China, because we don't hear a lot about that. And there are a lot of stories in here that were like really kind of surprising to me, like why Google failed in China, and like why Facebook had problems in China. And a lot of it was not because of Chinese government censorship. It was because basically the Chinese out-innovated. The Western companies wanted to do things the normal way, and the Chinese companies just made a ripoff, and they out-innovated specifically for the Chinese population and said, no, this is what they want. And of course the Chinese people said, yep, that's what we want, awesome. And then it exploded. So it's very interesting to see what's been going on in China. Give it a read if you want. And I guess we'll see what happens with the future of AI. So for more techie tips, see ScottiesTech.Info. Thanks for watching. See you next time.